Today, all hail the Georgia Peach, Little Richard. Hi there, welcome back for this week's edition of The Greatest Record Ever Made. I'm Carl Caffarelli, the co-host of This Is Rock and Roll Radio with Dana and Carl, heard every Sunday night from 9 to midnight here in Syracuse on Spark, WSPJ 103.3, 93.7 FM, and on the web at sparksyracuse.org. I'm also a writer and channeling my best Troy McClure from The Simpsons. You may remember me from Goldmine Magazine. Hey, speaking of The Simpsons. And from such books as Bubblegum Music is the Naked Truth, Shake Some Action, Lost in the Grooves, nice picture there, and Music Hound Rock. Those books were all other people's projects for which I was hired to contribute, and I was happy to do so. Now I'm working on my own book, my first ever book that's all mine, The Greatest Record Ever Made, Volume 1, dedicated to the notion that an infinite number of songs can each be the greatest record ever made as long as they take turns. And we know that that's what records do. And this week's edition of The Greatest Record Ever Made celebrates Little Richard, the Georgia Peach, and The Girl Can't Help It, the title theme from the first great rock and roll movie, 1958's The Girl Can't Help It. And if you've never seen the film, it's well worth checking out. It's funny, it's classy, it's got loads and loads of great stars singing their hits. It's got Julie London, it's got Jane Mansfield, and it has Little Richard. The highlight of the film occurs at the very beginning, where the lead character is talking about whatever he's talking about. It doesn't really matter. He's pontificating humorously, and he is shoved off screen by the image of Little Richard and his band singing The Girl Can't Help It. It is just magic. It is just thrilling in a way that I can't tell you. Recently saw Little Richard in a 1973 concert film called Let the Good Times Roll. It was actually my lovely wife Brenda and I watched that on New Year's Eve. I had never seen the film before. It's got some great live footage of Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Bo Diddley and Danny and the Juniors. It's just a really terrific concert film. Little Richard absolutely shines in there. Little Richard is certainly one of the most important figures in the history of rock and roll. And he's also not so much controversial, but certainly one of the most flamboyant figures in the 50s. The dichotomy of Little Richard at the height of his popularity is that he was a God-fearing, Bible Belt-bred black man singing the devil's music, certain that he was going to go to hell. Not only was he singing the devil's music, he was flamboyantly gay at a time when that was a crime. It was a dichotomy that was difficult for him to address and balance. And he left behind rock and roll music. He left behind secular music and went back to the church. He renounced his sexuality. He couldn't really keep away. The boy couldn't help it, if you will. The music that Little Richard recorded in the 50s is enormously influential, enormously impactful. I mean, one of the single largest influences on the Beatles, right up there with Chuck Berry, with Elvis Presley, the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly. Every time you hear Paul McCartney on those early Beatles records go, woo, that's Little Richard. I'm Down, the Lennon McCartney song that was the B-side to Help. That is a Little Richard homage. Almost a ripoff, but not quite. And a really well done one. The Girl Can't Help It is my favorite Little Richard song, which is why it's in the book as the greatest record ever made. Reading from the entry itself. Rock and roll and the movies have been joined in hot connubial bliss ever since the 1955 release of The Blackboard Jungle catapulted Bill Haley and his Comets to sudden, unexpected stardom by using the group's then obscure B-side track, Rock Around the Clock, as a musical shorthand for Teen Rebellion. Rock Around the Clock went 1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock to number 1, seemingly out of nowhere, establishing the starting point for what Billboard would eventually refer to as the rock and roll era. As Buck Owens would later note, the movies could make you a big star. In 1956, The Girl Can't Help It became the first great rock and roll movie, and it's still one of the greatest rock and roll movies of all time. The sight of Little Richard belting out the title tune during the film's opening sequence is nothing short of rock and roll history bopping on before your very eyes and tapping feet. Stranded in this conservative, straight-laced world of the 1950s, Little Richard was the Georgia Peach, a wild and effeminate black man, flamboyant, a strange visitor from another planet, with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. His performances were electrifying, pounding an irresistible symphony of woo, a wop bop a loo bop a lop bam boom. In the 50s, only Jerry Lee Lewis could match the sheer fervor of Little Richard. Little Richard was as bright a star as this dull world had ever seen. And he was certain he was going to hell. Richard was raised by the gospel, a believer in the good book and its spiritual music. The God that made him different. He liked flash. He liked attention. He was drawn to sing what would be called the devil's music. And he was drawn to other men. Salvation, sin. This was the tug of war that would play out in his consciousness, his conscience. A gay rock and roll star who believed in the promise of a heaven for the righteous. But who knew, or thought he knew, that who he was and what he did would condemn him to the pits for all eternity. He did it anyway. The boy couldn't help it. Damned, torpedoed, full speed ahead. In the opening of the film, The Girl Can't Help It, Little Richard embodies both the threat and the liberation of rock and roll with greater potency than any other performer could have, including Jerry Lee Lewis, including even Elvis, including any subsequent Johnny Rotten come lately. Won't you kindly be aware, the Georgia Peach had a lot of what they call the most. It wasn't a curse, and it wasn't sacrilege. It was a blessing from a benevolent God who wants us to sing and wants us to love. The devil has no music to call his own. Music comes from heaven, no matter how earthly or earthy its expression. Can I get an amen? Woo! Same thing, really. Rest in peace, our Georgia Peach. Thank you for joining me this week on The Greatest Record Ever Made. Next week, we turn to Neil Diamond and Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show. Below, you'll see options to support and tip. There'll be a link to the printed chapter about Little Richard that will be in the book. And I thank you on behalf of the Georgia Peach.